Story 1. The Echoing Voice. When my father turned 50, he fulfilled a lifelong dream by acquiring an African gray parrot. For as long as I could remember, he had been enamored with birds, particularly parrots, and often spoke of how intelligent they were, how they could mimic human speech, and how they could even understand certain words. He named the parrot Kevin, a simple name for a complex creature, and dedicated his post-retirement life to training Kevin, teaching him a wide vocabulary. My dad and Kevin quickly became inseparable, with the bird picking up words and phrases faster than anyone could have anticipated. Kevin wasn't just repeating sounds. He seemed to grasp the meaning behind them, responding to specific cues with an eerie accuracy. He could say, "Hello, what's up, food, thank you," and many other phrases. My father was incredibly proud of his feathered companion, often showing off Kevin's talents to anyone who would listen. When my father passed away at 70, it was a profound loss for our family. We were left not only with his absence, but with the daunting task of figuring out what to do with Kevin. My siblings and I were overwhelmed with grief and responsibilities, and the question of Kevin's future quickly became a point of contention. My brother and sister both had busy lives, spouses who were not keen on the idea of taking in a parrot, and homes that didn't have the space or the quiet Kevin would need. They suggested giving Kevin away, finding him a new home where he would be well cared for. But I couldn't bear the thought. Kevin was one of the last living connections to my father, and the idea of losing him felt like losing a part of Dad all over again. So I decided to take Kevin into my home. It wasn't an easy decision. Parrots live a long time, and Kevin was likely to outlive me, but I felt it was the right thing to do. My house didn't have a basement, so I placed Kevin's cage in the den, the lowest level of the house. The den became Kevin's domain, a quiet place where he could chirp and chatter to his heart's content without disturbing the rest of the household. Kevin was a moderately noisy bird. He had his moments of chatter, especially in the early hours of the day, but by evening, he would usually quiet down. When he became too noisy, I would cover his cage with a blanket, a signal that it was time to settle down for the night. Most nights, I would watch TV in the den to keep him company, and around p.m., I would migrate to my bedroom, leaving Kevin to sleep in peace. 2 years passed like this. Kevin became a fixture in my life, a comforting presence that reminded me of my father. I had grown accustomed to his behavior, so when something unusual happened, I noticed immediately. It was a cold December night, around p.m., when Kevin started making sounds while I was trying to sleep. I slept with my bedroom door open, a habit I had developed after my father's death, to ensure I could hear any disturbances in the house. Hearing Kevin squawking at this hour was unusual. He was usually quiet by now, resting on his perch after a day of chatter. But tonight, something was clearly bothering him. I got out of bed and made my way down to the den. Kevin was wide awake, perched on the lower of the 2 perches in his cage. He looked at me with those intelligent eyes of his and started saying the phrases my father had taught him: "Hello, what's up," even his own name. But there was something off about the way he was moving. He was nodding his head up and down, his whole body swaying as if he were dancing. It was a behavior I had never seen before, and it unsettled me. I tried to calm him down. I offered him food, thinking he might be hungry, but he didn't eat. Instead, he kept up his strange behavior, bobbing his head and repeating the same phrases over and over. I covered his cage with the blanket, hoping it would signal bedtime and quiet him down. But as I turned to leave the room, I heard a sound that made me stop in my tracks. It was a faint rustling coming from the pantry closet a few feet away from Kevin's cage. The pantry door was one of those with a large glass panel in the center, a feature that allowed light to filter through when the inside light was on. But the light was off, and the room was dark. I stood there for a moment, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. I had lived alone for the past few years, ever since my father's death, and I wasn't used to strange noises in the house at night. My rational mind told me it was probably nothing, maybe a mouse or a draft, but another part of me, the part that had grown more cautious since taking Kevin in, told me to be careful. I walked over to the pantry door, my hand hovering over the light switch. For a moment, I hesitated. Then, in one swift motion, I flicked the switch on. The light flooded the pantry, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the dim glow of the bulb, I saw the outline of a man, crouched in the corner, his face hidden in the shadows. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but instead I found myself frozen in place, staring at the intruder. My fight or flight response kicked in, and to my surprise, I chose fight. I flung the pantry door open and lunged at the man, screaming at the top of my lungs in an attempt to startle him, to get my adrenaline rushing. I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him out of the pantry, throwing him to the floor. He tried to fight back, but I was stronger, fueled by a mix of fear and rage. I pinned him down, holding him in a chokehold as I demanded to know who he was and why he was in my house. He was an older man, in his 50s, with the disheveled appearance of someone who had been living on the streets for a long time. He smelled of sweat and alcohol, his clothes tattered and filthy. He didn't answer my questions, instead trying to grab my face, perhaps in an attempt to gouge my eyes or free himself from my grip. But I was relentless, tightening my hold on him until he was gasping for breath. During the struggle, Kevin went berserk in his cage, screeching and flapping his wings, his distress adding to the chaos of the moment. The man on the floor grew weaker under my grip, and I knew I had to act fast. I released him just long enough to sprint to the nearest phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. As soon as I had the operator on the line, I rushed back to the man, keeping him pinned to the floor while I explained the situation. The police arrived within minutes, though it felt like an eternity. They took the man into custody, but he had no identification on him, nothing to indicate who he was or where he had come from. He was homeless, they told me, and likely had been squatting in my house for some time. The pantry, they discovered, was filled with food. He had taken jars of peanut butter, boxes of crackers, and other canned goods he had pilfered during his stay. I was shaken, but relieved that the ordeal was over. But as I sat in the den, trying to calm my nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Kevin was quiet now, resting on his perch, but the memory of his strange behavior lingered in my mind. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I replayed the events over and over in my head, trying to make sense of what had happened. How had the man gotten into my house? How long had he been there? And why hadn't I noticed anything unusual before? But most of all, I couldn't stop thinking about Kevin. His behavior that night had been so strange, so out of character, that I couldn't help but wonder if he had somehow known the man was there before I did. Kevin had always been perceptive, almost eerily so, but this was different. It was as if he had sensed the danger before I did, as if he had been trying to warn me. I started paying more attention to Kevin's behavior, watching for any signs that he might be sensing something I couldn't. For the most part, he seemed the same as always, chattering in the mornings, quieting down at night, but every now and then he would do something that sent a chill down my spine. He would stare at a corner of the room, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, or he would start bobbing his head and repeating phrases in that strange, mechanical way that reminded me of the night of the break-in. As the weeks passed, I began to notice other things as well. Strange noises in the house at odd hours, shadows that seemed to move on their own, and that feeling of being watched that had never quite gone away since the night of the break-in. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was still on edge after what had happened. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard Kevin start making noises in the den. It was the same as before, those strange, mechanical phrases, the bobbing of his head, but this time there was something different. His voice sounded off, distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I got out of bed and made my way to the den, my heart pounding in my chest. Kevin was on his perch, just as he had been before, but this time he wasn't alone. There, in the corner of the room, was a shadow. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, hovering just behind Kevin's cage. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, like a cold breeze that sent shivers down my spine. Kevin was still bobbing his head, still repeating those strange, distorted phrases, but now I could see that he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the shadow. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before I finally found the strength to move. I took a step forward, and as I did, the shadow seemed to retreat, fading into the darkness until it was gone. Kevin stopped his strange behavior and looked at me, tilting his head to one side as if to ask what was wrong. I didn't know how to answer him, didn't know what to do or say. I was terrified, but I didn't want to show it. I didn't want to give in to the fear that was threatening to overwhelm me. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the den, watching Kevin, waiting for the shadow to return. But it didn't. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but the shadow had never come back. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that I had imagined the shadow, that Kevin's strange behavior was just a coincidence. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started researching paranormal activity, trying to find some explanation for what I had seen. I read about spirits and ghosts, about how they could attach themselves to objects or places, and I wondered if that was what had happened with Kevin. Had my father somehow become trapped in the bird, his spirit unable to move on? Or was it something else, something darker? I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me, that the shadow was still there, lurking in the corners of my house, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. One night, as I was sitting in the den with Kevin, I heard a noise coming from the pantry. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. My heart started pounding as I got up to investigate, the memory of the break-in flashing through my mind. I opened the pantry door, half expecting to find another intruder, but there was nothing there. The pantry was empty, just as it had been since the night of the break-in. But as I stood there, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, like the touch of a hand on my skin. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just Kevin, sitting in his cage, watching me with those intelligent eyes of his. "Hello," he said, his voice calm and clear. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. I just stood there, staring at him, waiting for something to happen. And then, out of nowhere, Kevin started laughing. It was a high-pitched, mechanical laugh, like the sound of a recording played on repeat. It was a sound I had never heard him make before, and it sent a chill down my spine. I backed away from the cage, my heart racing, but Kevin just kept laughing, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly I turned, and there it was, the shadow, hovering just inches away from me. This time, I could see it more clearly. It was taller than before, more defined, with long, thin arms that seemed to reach out toward me. Its face was a dark void, like a hole in the fabric of reality, and its eyes, if you could call them, that were nothing more than empty sockets. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the shadow's gaze, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty again, just me and Kevin, and the sound of his laughter echoing in my ears. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I must have run out of the room, must have called someone for help, but it's all a blur. The next thing I remember is waking up in my bed, the sun shining through the window, and Kevin sitting on his perch, watching me. For a while, I thought it had all been a dream. But then, I saw the shadow again. It was always there, just out of the corner of my eye, a flicker in the darkness, a cold breeze on my skin. It never came close again, but the memory of that night lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. The next day, I found myself moving through my home with a heightened sense of awareness, my eyes constantly darting to shadows, ears perked for any unusual sounds. Kevin, too, seemed more subdued, as if the previous night's events had shaken him as well. He sat on his perch, occasionally muttering, "What's up?" or "hello," in a low, almost whispering tone. His usual exuberance dimmed. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that I was overreacting, that the night had just been a fluke, a perfect storm of coincidence that left me rattled. But the feeling that something wasn't right continued to gnaw at me. Even as I went about my daily routine, the unease hung over me, an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. Then, a week later, it happened again. It was late, probably around midnight, when I was jolted awake by Kevin's frantic squawking. This time, it was louder, more urgent, as if he were in a state of panic. I shot out of bed, heart hammering in my chest, and rushed down the stairs toward the den. When I reached the den, I found Kevin in a state of complete distress. He was flapping his wings wildly, his eyes wide with fear as he squawked incessantly. His feathers were ruffled, and he was moving erratically around his cage, his usual composure completely shattered. I had never seen him like this before, not even during the break-in. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked, my voice trembling as I approached the cage. I tried to calm him down, speaking softly to him, but it was no use. He continued to screech, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of the den. It was just a silhouette, tall and dark, with no discernible features, but it was unmistakably there, watching us. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as fear gripped me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, an oppressive presence that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Kevin's screeches grew louder, more frantic, as if he were trying to warn me, trying to get me to run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure, unable to tear myself away. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding all at once. Who or what was this? Was it the same man from before? Or was it something else entirely, something far more sinister? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure began to move. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide across the floor, its form shifting and flickering like a shadow cast by a dying flame. It moved closer, and as it did, the temperature in the room dropped, a bone-chilling cold seeping into my skin. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from this thing, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but watch as it drew nearer. Just as the figure reached the center of the room, something changed. Kevin, who had been screeching uncontrollably, suddenly fell silent. The room was plunged into an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The figure stopped, hovering in place, as if it were waiting for something, and then it spoke. The voice that came from the figure was deep and gravelly, like the sound of rocks grinding together. It wasn't human, and it didn't seem to come from any specific place. It echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls and filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. "Leave," it said, the single word hanging in the air like a death sentence. "This is not your home." The command sent a jolt through me, breaking the paralysis that had held me captive. My survival instincts kicked in, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of Kevin's cage in my haste to get away. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted from the room, my only thought to get as far away from that thing as possible. I raced up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and locked myself in my bedroom. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely press the buttons. When the operator answered, I could barely get the words out. "There's someone. Something in my house," I stammered, my voice trembling with fear. "Please, you have to send someone right away." The operator tried to calm me down, asking me questions about what was happening, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the shadowy figure in the den, the way it had glided toward me, the way it had spoken in that inhuman voice. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as I realized that help was on the way. But as the sirens grew louder, a new fear took hold of me. What if the figure was still there? What if it attacked the officers when they arrived? I stayed on the line with the operator until I heard the sound of the police arriving at my front door. I rushed downstairs, throwing the door open and nearly collapsing into the arms of the first officer I saw. "There's someone inside," I gasped, pointing toward the den. "You have to hurry." The officers moved quickly, drawing their weapons as they entered the house. I followed them at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. We reached the den, and I braced myself for what we might find, but when we entered the room, the shadowy figure was gone. The officers searched the entire house, but there was no sign of an intruder. No footprints, no broken windows, nothing to suggest that anyone or anything had been there. Kevin was quiet, perched on his lower rung, his feathers ruffled but otherwise calm. The officers questioned me for a while, asking if I had seen anything unusual, if there was any possibility that I had imagined the whole thing. I knew what they were thinking, that the stress of the break-in had gotten to me, that I was suffering from some kind of post-traumatic reaction. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. That thing in the den hadn't been a figment of my imagination. Still, with no evidence to support my story, there was little the police could do. They left after ensuring that the house was secure, telling me to call them if anything else happened. I thanked them, but I knew that whatever had visited me that night was beyond their help. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that I was being watched even when I was alone. I started sleeping with all the lights on, leaving the TV on at night to drown out the silence. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. Kevin, too, seemed changed. He was quieter, more subdued, as if the encounter had affected him as well. He would spend hours just sitting on his perch, staring at the corner of the room with an intensity that unnerved me. I tried to coax him into talking, to get him to return to his old self, but it was no use. He was as haunted as I was. Then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, the soft glow of the TV casting flickering shadows on the walls, when I heard Kevin start making noises in the den. This time, it wasn't his usual chatter. It was a low, rhythmic muttering, almost like he was reciting something under his breath. I got out of bed, my heart racing, and made my way downstairs. As I approached the den, the muttering grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something eerie about the way Kevin was speaking, almost as if he were in a trance. When I entered the den, I found Kevin perched on the edge of his cage, his eyes half closed as he repeated the same phrase over and over. It took me a moment to realize what he was saying. Leave. Not your home. Leave. Not your home. The words sent a chill down my spine. It was the same phrase the shadowy figure had spoken, the same inhuman voice that had echoed through the room that night. I stood there, frozen in place, as Kevin continued his chant, his voice growing louder and more insistent. It was as if he were channeling the spirit of the figure, repeating its command, warning me to get out, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, Kevin fell silent. He opened his eyes and looked at me, his gaze piercing and unnerving. For a moment, I felt a connection between us, a shared understanding of the terror that had invaded our home. But before I could react, the lights in the den flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I heard a rustling sound behind me, and when I turned around, the shadowy figure was there, standing in the doorway just as it had before. Only this time, it was different. It was more solid, more real, as if it had grown stronger, fed by the fear that had consumed me over the past few weeks. It moved toward me, its form shifting and flickering in the darkness, and I knew that this time, it wasn't going to let me go. I backed away, my mind racing as I searched for a way out. But the figure was too close, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the dread wrapping around my heart like a vice. And then, in a last-ditch effort, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed Kevin's cage and threw it at the figure. The cage hit the figure with a loud crash, and for a moment, the room was filled with a blinding light. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as if it were being torn apart. Kevin screeched, flapping his wings wildly as the cage tumbled to the floor. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it was almost unbearable, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The figure was gone, the room was still, and the only sound was the soft flutter of Kevin's wings as he settled back onto his perch. I stood there, panting, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The shadowy figure had vanished, leaving no trace behind, and the oppressive cold that had filled the room was gone. I looked down at Kevin, who was staring up at me with those intelligent eyes of his, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. Whatever had haunted us, whatever had invaded our home, it was gone. Kevin had saved me, just as he had the night of the break-in. And as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't help but feel that my father, in some way, had been watching over me through Kevin all along. From that night on, things began to return to normal. The strange noises and shadows disappeared, and the feeling of being watched faded away. Kevin, too, returned to his old self, chattering happily in the mornings and settling down at night. But every now and then, I would catch him staring at a corner of the room, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. And in those moments, I would remember the figure in the den, the way it had moved, the way it had spoken. I never told anyone about what happened. It was too strange, too unbelievable. But I knew the truth. I had been visited by something otherworldly, something that had tried to take over my home. And if it weren't for Kevin, I might not be here to tell the tale. To this day, I keep Kevin's cage in the den, a constant reminder of the night he saved my life. And every evening, as the sun sets and the shadows begin to lengthen, I make sure to say a silent thank you to my father, wherever he may be, for sending Kevin to watch over me, because in a world full of shadows and unseen terrors, sometimes all you need is a friend to help you find the light. Story 2. The Haunting of Ashford Manor. Ashford Manor had always been a place of whispers and ghost stories. Built in the late 1800s, the grand estate had once been the jewel of the countryside, a sprawling mansion surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens and dense ancient woods. The manor was the pride of Lord Edgar Ashford, a man known for his wealth, his eccentricities, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. For decades, Ashford Manor stood vacant, slowly decaying as nature reclaimed the land. Locals claimed the estate was cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of the Ashford family. Stories circulated of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, of ghostly figures roaming the grounds, and of the eerie wails that could be heard on windless nights. Few dared to venture near the manor, and those who did never stayed long. It was into this setting that Emily Walters found herself, an aspiring writer with a fascination for the supernatural. After the sudden death of her parents, Emily had inherited a modest sum of money and decided to leave her life in the city behind. She was drawn to the countryside, to the solitude it offered, and to the prospect of writing her first novel in peace. When she stumbled upon the listing for Ashford Manor, she was intrigued. The estate was in disrepair, the listing had warned, but it was being offered at a price that was shockingly low for such a grand property. Emily saw it as an opportunity, a chance to own a piece of history, to live in a place steeped in mystery and legend. Against the advice of her friends, who warned her of the manor's dark reputation, Emily purchased the estate. She was a skeptic by nature, more interested in the stories the manor inspired than in any belief in the supernatural. To her, the manor was simply a beautiful old house in need of some TLC, not a place to fear. The day Emily moved in was overcast, the sky a heavy gray that matched the somber mood of the manor. She arrived in the late afternoon, the movers unloading her belongings into the grand foyer. The interior of the house was as magnificent as she had imagined: high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and large windows that offered views of the overgrown gardens and the dense woods beyond. But there was also a sense of neglect. The wallpaper was peeling in places, the floors creaked with every step, and the air was thick with the musty scent of a house long abandoned. Still, Emily was undeterred. She saw potential in the manor, a chance to restore it to its former glory. That first night, as she lay in bed, Emily found it difficult to sleep. The house was full of strange noises, the groaning of the old pipes, the creaking of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind through the trees outside. It was all to be expected, she told herself. Old houses made noises, and it was just something she would have to get used to. But as the days passed, Emily began to notice other things that couldn't be so easily explained. It started with the lights. The manor was equipped with electricity, though the wiring was old and in need of updating. On several occasions, Emily noticed the lights flickering, as if struggling to stay on. At first, she chalked it up to faulty wiring, but then the lights began to turn on and off on their own, sometimes in rooms she wasn't even in. Then there were the footsteps. Late at night, as Emily sat in the study working on her novel, she would hear the sound of footsteps above her, as if someone were walking the halls on the second floor. The first time it happened, she dismissed it as the house settling, but as the nights went on, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. One evening, as she was preparing to go to bed, she heard the footsteps again, this time followed by the sound of a door creaking open. Heart pounding, she grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made her way upstairs. The hallway was empty, the doors to the bedrooms all closed. She checked each room, but there was no sign of anyone or anything out of place. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold prickle at the back of her neck that wouldn't go away. Emily began to feel uneasy in the house, as if she were never truly alone. She started leaving lights on at night, the soft glow of the lamps offering a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. The turning point came one night when Emily was awakened by the sound of someone crying. It was a soft, mournful sound, like a child sobbing quietly in the dark. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and strained to listen. The sound was coming from somewhere in the house, but it was faint, as if it were far away. Grabbing her flashlight, Emily got out of bed and followed the sound. It led her down the hallway, past the grand staircase, and toward the back of the house. The crying grew louder as she approached a door at the end of the hall, a door she had never opened before. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She hesitated, fear gnawing at her, but curiosity pushed her forward. Slowly, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and windowless, lit only by the beam of her flashlight. The air was cold and damp, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty old books and trinkets. In the center of the room stood a large antique mirror, its glass cracked and fogged with age. The crying had stopped the moment she opened the door, the silence that followed thick and oppressive. Emily shone her flashlight around the room, her pulse quickening as she searched for the source of the sound. But there was nothing there, just the musty smell of old paper and wood. She stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection distorted by the cracks in the glass. As she peered into it, she felt a sudden chill, as if a cold hand had brushed against her skin. She jumped back, her breath coming in short gasps, but there was nothing behind her, just the empty room. A sense of dread washed over her, and she quickly backed out of the room, closing the door behind her. She hurried back to her bedroom, her heart still pounding, and locked the door. That night, she slept with the lights on, the covers pulled tight around her, but sleep did not come easily. The next morning, Emily tried to convince herself that it had all been a dream, a product of her overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. The crying, the footsteps, the flickering lights, it was as if the house were alive, trying to communicate with her, trying to tell her something. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Emily began researching the history of Ashford Manor. She spent hours in the local library, poring over old records and newspapers, piecing together the story of the Ashford family. Lord Edgar Ashford had been a reclusive man, known for his wealth and eccentricities. He had married late in life, and his wife, Lady Eleanor, had died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the birth of their only child, a daughter named Clara. The death of his wife had sent Lord Ashford into a downward spiral, and he became increasingly obsessed with the occult, reportedly holding seances and rituals in an attempt to contact his deceased wife. The records showed that Clara had been a sickly child, rarely seen by anyone outside of the household staff. She had died at the age of 10, and her death had been ruled as a result of her illness. But there were whispers, rumors that Lord Ashford had been involved in dark practices, that he had tried to use his daughter as a conduit to reach his wife in the afterlife. After Clara's death, Lord Ashford had become even more reclusive, rarely leaving the manor. He had died a few years later, and the estate had passed through various owners before being abandoned altogether. As Emily delved deeper into the history, she began to feel a connection to the house, a sense of understanding that had eluded her before. The house was haunted, not just by the spirits of the Ashford family, but by the weight of their grief, their unfulfilled desires, and the dark secrets that had been buried with them. But there was something else, something that kept nagging at her, the mirror in the small room at the back of the house. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was important, that it held the key to understanding the strange occurrences in the house. One night, unable to sleep, Emily decided to confront her fears. She grabbed her flashlight and made her way to the small room, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The house was silent as she walked down the hallway, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. But she steeled herself and pushed the door open. Stepping into the cold, damp room, the mirror stood in the center of the room, just as she had left it. The cracks in the glass seemed to form a spiderweb of fractures, distorting her reflection as she approached. The air was thick with tension, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Taking a deep breath, Emily reached out and touched the surface of the mirror. The glass was cold under her fingertips, sending a shiver down her spine. She stared into the mirror, her reflection wavering in the dim light, and then something changed. The room around her began to fade, the walls and shelves dissolving into darkness. The air grew colder, and Emily felt a pressure in her chest, as if something were squeezing the life out of her. She tried to pull her hand away, but it was as if it were glued to the mirror. Her fingers stuck to the icy surface. Panic surged through her, but before she could react, the darkness around her solidified, forming shapes and shadows. She was no longer in the small room. She was standing in the grand foyer of the manor, but it was different. The walls were clean, the floors polished, and the chandeliers above her head sparkled with light, but the house wasn't empty. Figures moved through the hallways, their faces blurred and indistinct. Emily could hear the soft murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, and the distant strains of music. It was as if she had stepped back in time, to a moment when the house had been alive with the energy of its inhabitants. She watched in awed terror as the scene unfolded around her. The figures moved with purpose, but there was something off about them, something that sent a chill down her spine. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were puppets being controlled by an unseen hand, and then she saw her. A little girl, no older than 10, standing at the foot of the grand staircase. She was dressed in a simple white nightgown, her hair falling in soft curls around her face. Her eyes were wide and sad, and she clutched a small, worn doll to her chest. Emily knew immediately who she was: Clara Ashford. The little girl looked up, her gaze meeting Emily's. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, and in that moment, Emily felt a deep, overwhelming sadness wash over her. Clara opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she began to cry, the same soft, mournful sobs that had woken Emily on that first night. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls and reverberating through Emily's mind. The other figures in the room continued to move, oblivious to the little girl's distress. Emily wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But she was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. Clara's sobs grew louder, more desperate, and Emily felt tears welling up in her own eyes. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how. And then the scene around her began to change. The walls of the manor started to darken, the light fading as shadows crept across the floor. The figures in the room began to blur, their movements growing more frantic, more chaotic. Ashford Manor had always been a place of whispers and ghost stories. Built in the late 1800s, the grand estate had once been the jewel of the countryside, a sprawling mansion surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens and dense ancient woods. The manor was the pride of Lord Edgar Ashford, a man known for his wealth, his eccentricities, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. The scene dissolved into chaos, the figures in the room twisting and contorting as the darkness consumed them. Emily could feel the pressure in her chest growing stronger, the weight of the manor's secrets threatening to crush her, and then, with a final surge of energy, she tore her hand away from the mirror. The room snapped back into focus, the darkness dissipating as the cold, damp air of the small room returned. Emily stumbled backward, gasping for breath, her heart racing with fear. She had seen something she wasn't meant to see, something that had been hidden for decades. The truth of Ashford Manor, the secrets that had been buried with the Ashford family, were beginning to reveal themselves, but the house wasn't done with her yet. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences in the manor intensified. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, and the crying could be heard almost every night. Objects in the house began to move on their own, and Emily would often find doors that she had closed standing wide open. But it was the mirror that haunted her the most. Every time she passed the small room, she could feel its presence, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to be waiting for her. She tried to avoid it, to stay away from the room, but it was as if the mirror had a hold on her, drawing her back to it. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Emily made a decision. She would leave Ashford Manor. She couldn't stay in a place that was so deeply haunted by the past, so filled with sorrow and pain. She would sell the estate, find a new home, and try to forget the horrors she had witnessed, but on the night she was to leave, something happened that changed everything. It was late, the house silent, as Emily packed the last of her belongings. She had made arrangements to stay with a friend until she could find a new place, and she was eager to be gone from the manor for good. As she carried a box down the grand staircase, she heard it again, the soft, mournful crying that had haunted her since the first night. But this time it was different. It was louder, more desperate, as if the source of the cries was closer than ever before. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The crying was coming from the small room, the room with the mirror. Something inside her snapped. She couldn't leave, not without knowing the truth, not without understanding what had happened to Clara, to the Ashford family. She had to face the mirror one last time. She dropped the box and hurried down the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. When she reached the door, she hesitated, fear gnawing at her, but she pushed it aside. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She opened the door and stepped into the room, the cold air wrapping around her like a shroud. The mirror stood in the center, its cracked surface reflecting her pale, trembling face. The crying had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on her like a weight. Emily approached the mirror, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and then she saw it. In the mirror, just behind her reflection, stood Clara. The little girl's face was pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with fear. She was reaching out to Emily, her small hand trembling as she tried to grasp for something, anything to hold on to. Emily's heart broke at the sight. She reached out, her hand hovering over the surface of the mirror, wanting to comfort the little girl, to tell her that she wasn't alone. But as her fingers touched the glass, the room around her shifted, the air growing colder, thicker. The mirror began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light, and the darkness that had consumed the manor began to seep into the room. The pressure in Emily's chest returned, stronger than ever, and she could feel the presence of something dark, something malevolent, closing in around her. Clara's image in the mirror began to fade, her hand slipping away as the darkness consumed her once again. "No," Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. "Please, don't leave her." But it was too late. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, the glass exploding outward in a shower of shards. Emily was thrown backward, her body slamming into the wall as the darkness filled the room. For a moment, she was lost in the void, the weight of the manor's secrets crushing her from all sides. She could feel the despair, the anger, the pain that had festered in the house for so long, and it threatened to consume her. But then, just as she thought she would be swallowed by the darkness, a light appeared. It was faint at first, a small, flickering flame in the distance. But it grew brighter, stronger, until it was blinding, cutting through the darkness like a knife. Emily reached for the light, her hand outstretched, and as she did, she felt the pressure in her chest begin to ease. The darkness began to recede, pulled back by the light, and the room around her started to come back into focus. When the light finally faded, Emily found herself lying on the floor, surrounded by the shattered remains of the mirror. The room was silent, the air clear, and the oppressive weight that had filled the manor was gone. She sat up slowly, her body aching, and looked around. The small room was just as it had been before, the shelves lined with dusty books and trinkets. But there was something different, something lighter, as if the house had been cleansed, and then she saw her. Clara stood in the doorway, her face calm and serene. She was no longer the frightened, sobbing child that Emily had seen in the mirror. She looked peaceful, at rest, as if she had finally been freed from the darkness that had held her captive for so long. The little girl smiled at Emily, a soft, grateful smile, and then she turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps light and free. Emily watched her go, a sense of peace settling over her. She knew that Clara was finally at rest, that the spirits of Ashford Manor had been laid to rest. The house was no longer haunted, no longer cursed by the pain and sorrow of the past. It was just a house, an old, beautiful house that had been given a second chance. And as Emily walked out of the small room and down the grand staircase, she knew that she too had been given a second chance. A chance to move on, to let go of the past, and to start a new chapter in her life. Ashford Manor would always hold a special place in her heart, not as a place of fear, but as a place of healing, of redemption, and as she stepped out into the cool, crisp air of the countryside, she knew that she was finally free. Story 3. The Keeper of the Graveyard. The small town of Harrogate was known for many things: its picturesque streets, lined with quaint shops, its annual fall festival that drew visitors from all over the state, and the old cemetery that sat on the outskirts of town. But above all, Harrogate was known for the legend of the Keeper. The cemetery, officially known as Greenwood Cemetery, had been established in the early 1800s. It was a sprawling plot of land, bordered by thick woods and crisscrossed with narrow, winding paths. The headstones, some weathered and crumbling with age, marked the final resting places of generations of Harrogate's residents. But it wasn't the cemetery's age or size that made it famous. It was the stories of the Keeper. According to local legend, the Keeper was a spirit, a ghostly figure that had haunted the cemetery for over a century. He was said to be the restless soul of the cemetery's first groundskeeper, a man named Samuel Blackwood, who had taken his own life under mysterious circumstances. The stories claimed that Samuel had been driven mad by something he had seen or done in the cemetery, something that had tormented him even in death. No one knew exactly what had happened to Samuel, but ever since his death, strange things had been reported in the cemetery graves that appeared to have been dug up and then filled in again, the sound of shovels scraping against the earth in the dead of night, and sightings of a shadowy figure wandering among the graves. Most townspeople dismissed the stories as nothing more than ghost tales, the kind of thing that small towns were known for. But there were always those who believed, those who swore they had seen the Keeper with their own eyes. They spoke of a tall, gaunt figure dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his eyes empty and hollow, carrying a lantern as he made his rounds among the graves. Despite the stories, the cemetery remained a place of peace, a sanctuary for those who came to visit their loved ones. But the legend of the Keeper cast a long shadow over Harrogate, a reminder that some secrets were best left buried. It was in this town, with its rich history and eerie tales, that Rachel Turner found herself one crisp autumn afternoon. Rachel was a journalist, a writer for a regional magazine that specialized in local folklore and legends. She had been assigned to write a feature on Harrogate, with a particular focus on the cemetery and the legend of the Keeper. Rachel had always been fascinated by ghost stories and the paranormal, and she was excited by the prospect of delving into the mystery of Samuel Blackwood. She had done her research, reading up on the history of the cemetery and the various accounts of the keeper. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to uncover. She arrived in Harrogate just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town. The air was cool and crisp, the trees ablaze with the colors of fall. Rachel parked her car in front of the town's small inn, where she would be staying for the duration of her visit. After checking in, she wasted no time in heading out to the cemetery, eager to get a feel for the place before the sun fully set. Greenwood Cemetery was just as she had imagined it, sprawling and serene, with an air of quiet reverence that belied the stories that surrounded it. The entrance was marked by a wrought iron gate, its ornate design partially obscured by creeping ivy. The paths were lined with old, weathered headstones, some leaning precariously to one side, others barely legible after years of exposure to the elements. Rachel walked slowly through the cemetery, taking in the sights and sounds. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the wind whispered through the trees, creating a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. She paused in front of an especially old headstone, the name worn away by time, and imagined the life of the person buried beneath it. Who were they? What had their life been like? And how did they feel about being part of a cemetery with such a dark legend? As she continued her walk, the sun dipped lower in the sky, and the cemetery was bathed in a soft, golden light. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and Rachel found herself wondering if the stories about the keeper were nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. But as the light began to fade, a sense of unease settled over her. The shadows grew longer, deeper, and the temperature seemed to drop. Rachel pulled her jacket tighter around her, suddenly aware of how alone she was. The cemetery, which had seemed so welcoming in the daylight, now felt oppressive, as if the very air were charged with something unseen. She glanced at her watch and realized she had been there longer than she intended. It was time to head back to the inn. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement among the trees at the edge of the cemetery. Rachel stopped, her heart skipping a beat. She stared into the shadows, but whatever she had seen was gone. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, chalking it up to her imagination. But curiosity got the better of her, and she found herself walking toward the trees, her footsteps hesitant on the gravel path. As she approached the edge of the cemetery, the sense of unease grew stronger. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together to form a dense canopy that blocked out the fading light. The shadows beneath them were thick, impenetrable, and Rachel could feel the weight of the legend pressing down on her. She stopped at the edge of the path, peering into the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. But then she saw it again, a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should turn back, leave the cemetery, and return to the safety of the inn. But something compelled her to stay, to find out what or who was moving in the darkness. She took a step forward, then another, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows seemed to shift around her, as if the trees themselves were alive, watching her every move. And then she saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the reach of the dying light. The keeper. Rachel froze, her mind racing. She had read about the keeper, heard the stories, but she had never expected to see him, to come face to face with the legend. He was exactly as the stories described, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with a lantern in one hand. His face was obscured by the shadows, but she could feel his eyes on her, empty and hollow. For a moment, neither of them moved. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps, her body tense with fear. The keeper stood still, his lantern casting a faint, eerie glow that seemed to make the shadows dance around him. Then, slowly, he began to move. He didn't walk. He glided, his feet never touching the ground, as if he were a part of the shadows themselves. He moved closer, and Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to run, to turn and flee back to the safety of the town, but her legs refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the keeper as he approached. The lantern in his hand flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows across the trees. Finally, the keeper stopped, just a few feet away from her. His presence was overwhelming, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Rachel's breath fogged in the cool night air, her pulse racing in her ears. For a long moment, they simply stood there, staring at each other. Rachel's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, trying to reconcile the legend with the reality in front of her, and then the keeper spoke. His voice was low and hollow, like the wind rustling through the trees. It was the voice of someone who had been dead for a long time, someone who had seen and experienced things that no living person could comprehend. "Why are you here?" he asked, his words slow and deliberate. Rachel swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She tried to find her voice, but the fear that gripped her made it difficult to speak. I'm a writer," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to write about the cemetery, about you." The keeper's head tilted slightly, as if he were considering her words. The lantern in his hand flickered again, the light growing dimmer. "You should not be here," he said, his tone grave. "This place is not for the living." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to ask him more, to understand why he was there, why he was haunting the cemetery, but the words wouldn't come. The keeper seemed to sense her hesitation, and he took a step closer. The cold around him intensified, and Rachel felt as though the very life was being drained from her. "Leave this place," the keeper said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Leave before it's too late." Rachel felt a surge of fear and instinctively took a step back. Her body finally responded, and she turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she fled the cemetery. She didn't stop running until she reached the safety of the inn. She burst through the door, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a kind face, looked up in surprise as Rachel stumbled into the lobby. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Rachel nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a weak smile. "Just a little shaken up." The innkeeper's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she could see through Rachel's facade. But she didn't press the issue. "You should get some rest," she said gently. "The cemetery can be a strange place at night." Rachel nodded again and made her way to her room. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart still racing. The encounter with the keeper played over and over in her mind, the memory of his hollow voice sending shivers down her spine. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the small desk in her room, trying to make sense of what had happened. She had come to Harrogate to write about a legend, but now she found herself caught up in it, trapped in a story that was far more real than she had ever imagined. The next morning, Rachel felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. She had to know more. She couldn't leave Harrogate without understanding what had happened, without uncovering the truth behind the legend of the keeper. She spent the day in the town library, digging through old records and archives. She read everything she could find about Samuel Blackwood, the first groundskeeper of Greenwood Cemetery, and the circumstances of his death. According to the records, Samuel had been a devoted caretaker, spending nearly every waking moment tending to the graves and keeping the cemetery in pristine condition. But there was one entry in particular that caught Rachel's attention, a journal entry written by the town's doctor at the time, detailing Samuel's last days. The journal described Samuel as a man driven to the brink of madness, plagued by visions and nightmares that he couldn't escape. He spoke of hearing voices, of seeing shadows moving among the graves, of something dark and malevolent that was buried deep within the cemetery. The doctor had tried to help him, but it was too late. Samuel had become convinced that he was the only one who could keep whatever was buried in the cemetery from escaping, that it was his duty to protect the town from the evil that lurked within the graves. The entry ended with a chilling account of Samuel's death. He had been found hanging from a tree in the cemetery, his body cold and lifeless. The doctor had noted that there was something strange about the scene, something that didn't make sense. The ground beneath Samuel's body had been disturbed, as if someone or something had been digging. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she read the words. There was something more to the story, something that had been buried along with Samuel. But what was it? And why was the keeper still there, still haunting the cemetery after all these years? Determined to find answers, Rachel returned to the cemetery that evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the gravestones, and the air was thick with the scent of fallen leaves. She walked slowly along the paths, her eyes scanning the graves, searching for any sign of the keeper. As she reached the far end of the cemetery, she saw it a grave, separate from the others, its headstone cracked and weathered. The name on the stone was barely legible, but Rachel could just make out the words, Samuel Blackwood. The grave was overgrown with weeds, the earth around it uneven and disturbed. Rachel felt a sense of unease as she approached, the same feeling she had experienced the night before. She knelt beside the grave, brushing away the dirt and leaves that had accumulated over the years. As she did, she noticed something strange, a small, rusted metal box, half buried in the earth at the foot of the grave. Rachel's heart raced as she carefully pried the box from the ground. It was old and corroded, the metal nearly disintegrating in her hands. She opened it slowly, unsure of what she would find inside. The box contained a small bundle of papers, yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. Rachel's hands trembled as she unfolded them, revealing pages filled with Samuel's cramped handwriting. The pages were a journal, written in the weeks leading up to Samuel's death. They detailed his descent into madness, his growing paranoia, and his belief that something evil was buried in the cemetery, something that he had accidentally unearthed while digging a grave. Samuel wrote of strange occurrences, of seeing shadows moving in the night, of hearing whispers that seemed to come from the very earth itself. He became convinced that the cemetery was cursed, that it was his duty to keep the evil contained, to prevent it from spreading to the town. The final entry was short, barely more than a few lines scrawled in a shaky hand. It was a confession, an admission that he had uncovered something that should have stayed buried, something that had driven him to the brink of madness. I can hear them, the entry read. The voices. They won't stop. I've seen what they've buried here. I've seen the darkness that lies beneath. I can't let it escape. I must keep it here, even if it costs me my soul. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she read the words. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, the legend of the keeper, the strange occurrences in the cemetery, the disturbed graves. Samuel had uncovered something dark and terrible, something that had haunted the cemetery for over a century. But what was it? And why was the keeper still there, still guarding the cemetery after all these years? As Rachel stood to leave, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air around her grew cold, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching out toward her like dark, grasping fingers. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and there he was, the keeper, standing at the edge of the trees, his lantern casting an eerie glow across the gravestones. His hollow eyes met hers, and Rachel felt the weight of his sorrow, his despair. He had been trapped in this place for so long, bound to the cemetery by the darkness he had uncovered, The keeper took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. Rachel wanted to run, to flee the cemetery and never look back, but she knew she couldn't. She had to know the truth. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What did you find?" The keeper stopped, his lantern flickering in the cold night air. For a moment, he said nothing, his hollow eyes locked on hers. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "It was never meant to be found," he said, his tone filled with sorrow. "But I was foolish. I thought I could contain it. I thought I could keep it buried." Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. "What was it?" The keeper hesitated, as if he were struggling to find the words. "It is darkness," he finally said, his voice heavy with regret. "It is the evil that lies within all of us, buried deep in the earth. I uncovered it, and it consumed me." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The stories, the legends, they were all true. The keeper had unearthed something terrible, something that had driven him to madness and death, but she could see now that the keeper was not the villain of the story. He was the victim, a man who had been trapped in a nightmare of his own making, forced to guard the cemetery for all eternity. "I'm sorry," Rachel whispered, her heart aching for the man who had suffered for so long. The keeper's hollow eyes softened, and for a moment, Rachel thought she saw a flicker of gratitude in his gaze. But then the lantern in his hand flickered one last time, and he began to fade, dissolving into the shadows that surrounded him. As he disappeared, Rachel felt a sense of peace wash over her. The air grew warmer, the shadows retreating as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The cemetery was still and silent, the graves bathed in the soft golden light of morning. Rachel stood alone in the clearing, the rusted box still clutched in her hands. The keeper was gone, his soul finally at rest. The darkness he had unearthed had been contained, buried deep in the earth where it could do no more harm. Rachel took a deep breath and looked down at the journal in her hands. She had found the truth, uncovered the secrets of the cemetery, and brought peace to the restless spirit that had haunted it for so long. And as she walked away from Greenwood Cemetery, she knew that she would never forget the keeper, the man who had sacrificed everything to protect the town from the darkness that lay beneath the graves. The legend of the keeper would live on. But Rachel knew that it was no longer a story of fear and horror. It was a story of sacrifice, of redemption, and of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of evils. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.